For thousands of years, the native peoples of the Pacific Northwest lived successfully off the land and waters as hunters, gatherers, and fishers. The Northwest was a good place to live since wild food was relatively abundant. A mainstay of the Indians' diet, and in some locations the single most important food, was salmon, the fish that every year swarmed out of the ocean and up the rivers to spawn. And probably the most important location for catching salmon was Celilo Falls on the Columbia River near the present-day Oregon town of the Dalles. Celilo Falls has been gone for decades now, flooded in 1957 when the federal government erected a giant dam that raised the level of the river. The fall of Celilo represents a turning point in the history of the Pacific Northwest. The name Celilo, or Wyam in the Indian language, means echo of falling water. Indians gathered at these waterfalls, this unique and powerful place of transition on the river, just as the adult salmon did. The Indians usually fished with nets on the end of long poles, and most often wielded these dip nets from platforms. For the Indians, fishing was not a sport. For many, the salmon meant food for their families. Salmon were also goods they could trade or sell. For many, salmon meant even more. The fish were part of a way of life and a living expression of something eternal, a certain relationship with the natural world. Use of the falls and the nearby shoreline date back 10,000 years or more. Fishing there involved the whole family. Everyone had a role to play. Children were introduced to the experience of Celilo when young. A child was a member of a tribe, and for the local river tribes, the Wyams, the Wishrams, and the Wascos, Celilo was not just a place, it was an inheritance. Where a family could fish was dictated by hereditary rights, and traditionally, fishing was regulated by a local chief. During the first half of the 20th century, the Celilo chief was known to the whites as Tommy Thompson. Indian families had their own sites, their own platforms. While the men fished, the women had the very important roles of cleaning and preparing the fish. Historically, the Indians of the Columbia River obtained about 40% of their food calories year-round from the salmon. Because more fish could be caught than were needed for immediate consumption, many were dried to preserve them for eating later. Once they could follow the grown-ups' rules, youngsters fished too, along with the men. Other children caught lamprey, eel-like fish that the Indians also prized. To fish so close to a raging river required sure footwork. It also required strength, skill, and stamina. Although in modern times a fisherman tied a rope around his waist in case he should fall off the slippery platform, men did slip off and sometimes drowned. But this was life at Celilo, and the rewards of being there outweighed the risks.
My grandmother really loved fish, and that was something that was very important to her, for us to go to a river, a body of water, and watch fish jump. And we'd go fishing, of course, and my grandfather fished at Celilo, and my family on my mother's side all fished. They were fishers.
Some of my uncles, my grandfather fished there. My aunts had been married to other people from different tribes that fished there, and they all shared the fishery.
The scale and significance of the traditional Indian fishery can be glimpsed in journal entries by the explorers Lewis and Clark in 1805. At one village in the vicinity of Celilo, they saw reed baskets full of dried salmon. They counted more than 100 stacks of fish, which they estimated weighed 10,000 pounds. At the falls, Clark reported on the Indians' trade in dried salmon.
Thus preserved, those fish may be kept sound and sweet several years, as those people inform me. Great quantities are sold to the white peoples who visit the mouth of the river, as well as the natives below. William Clark.
So vital to their way of life was salmon that when the Columbia River Indians consented to treaties with the federal government in the 1850s and gave up millions of acres of land, they reserved the right to fish in their usual and accustomed places. But the European Americans who followed Lewis and Clark in the mid-19th century quickly dominated the salmon resource. Starting in the 1860s, the settlers used the new technique of canning and employed immigrant laborers to develop a huge global commerce, shipping canned salmon throughout the industrialized world. On the Columbia, fish wheels snared vast quantities of salmon that might otherwise have gone to the Indians or have escaped to spawn.
I think that the Indians had all the concepts that the Europeans brought, with possibly the exception of the fish wheel, but they had hook and line, weirs, nets, all the gears that we commonly know. In terms of purpose, the Indian fishers seemed to be people who were more interested in maintaining a continuity of the fishery, and the Euro-Americans came to basically make as much profit as they could. In the first few years, they were talking about overexploiting the fishery.
Less than a half-century after the whites began, the quantity of salmon available not only for them but for Indian fishers had entered a steep decline. It wasn't only fishing that was different now. European-American development pushed against the tribes from all directions. While the Indians at Celilo continued to devote their attention to fishing on the Columbia, the riverbanks and the Indian village there were encroached by railroad lines in the late 1800s. The village was split by the train tracks. Then in 1915, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers finished a canal in the river from the Dalles to Celilo to route traffic around the hazardous falls. The dedication of the canal brought people together in the Dalles, about 80 miles upriver from Portland, to celebrate this feat of engineering. Portland lawyer and liberal politician Joseph Nathan Teal described how the canal's supporters had improved the Columbia and had freed the river from its natural condition.
This mighty work symbolizes the stern, unfaltering determination of the people that our waters shall be free. Free to serve the uses and purposes of a divine providence.
Joseph Nathan Teal spoke in terms of freeing the river, that the canal, in fact, liberated the river from its former shackles. And the metaphor, the open river, actually had two references. One was making transportation past the Long Narrows and Celilo Falls possible, but it also had to do with freeing the river from monopoly, i.e. the railroad. Of course, the railroad then dropped its rates.
Above Celilo, there are many rapids which ultimately will be improved by means of locks and dams and the general canalization of the river. With every dam, water power will be created, and this power should be utilized. All beneficial uses of these streams should be taken advantage of. And when the proper improvement of the Columbia and Snake Rivers is accomplished, the Inland Empire will be an empire in fact as well as in name. Joseph Nathan Teal.
Teal's vision of harnessing the Columbia into an engine of prosperity became the dominant idea about the river in the 1930s. The Great Depression of that decade affected the entire society, and with millions unemployed, Americans were eager for work and a sense of opportunity. Franklin Delano Roosevelt might have seemed an unlikely president for the times. A wealthy patrician from New York, Roosevelt became the champion of the uprooted and the unemployed, supporting public works projects in the West. Principal among these were huge dams that created both jobs and hydroelectric power. Roosevelt's enthusiasm for developing the Columbia was voiced early, during the presidential campaign of 1920, when he was the Democratic Party candidate for vice president.
He visits Spokane, and he speaks directly to the issue of developing the Columbia River, building dams on the Columbia River for power production. And as soon as he's sworn into office in March of 1933, he's released money to build dams on the Columbia River, and particularly Bonneville, which was already well into the planning stages, and the first work that was done on Grand Coulee. So he's the single most significant person, I think, for the beginnings of building dams on the Columbia River.
Having created the Bonneville Power Administration, Roosevelt traveled back to Oregon in 1937 for the ceremonies opening Bonneville Dam.
And so, my friends, that is why, in developing electricity from this Bonneville Dam, from the Grand Coulee Dam, and from other dams to be built in the future on the Columbia and its tributaries, as they're going to be, this policy of the widest use ought to prevail. The transmission of electricity is making such scientific strides today that we can well visualize a date not far distant when every community in this vast area will be fully electrified.
Roosevelt understood progress as the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people. What stood in the way of such progress? The natural river itself, said the Bonneville Power Administration. Hydro, their public relations film, portrayed the Columbia as an unruly antagonist that it was right to subdue.
At Bonneville, Oregon, man takes up the struggle against the frontier. Cascade Rapids, since pioneer days the graveyard of ill-fated ships, in 1933 make way for Bonneville Dam. America's conquest of the Columbia has begun. Day and night, sand and gravel and cement were merged in the massive structure rising in the river chasm. As the powerhouse takes shape on the drawing board, the very force that for years blocked the river now makes possible a new northwest passage.
Conquering the Columbia and developing hydropower were not only a benefit to the Northwest, said the BPA, the Bonneville Power Administration. In another public relations film just after the Second World War, the federal agency took pains to argue how the venture was also vital to the nation during the war.
Men and materials we had, factories we could build. But America desperately lacked one vital element: electricity. Electric power, the essential ingredient of aluminum and magnesium, the key to electrochemicals and shipbuilding. In this hour of need, America looked westward to her last great hydroelectric reservoir, the Columbia River.
Indeed, inexpensive Columbia hydropower made manufacturing and aluminum production into major economic players in the region. In the period following World War II, these and other economic interests combined to push Congress into authorizing the construction of more dams on the mid-Columbia and lower Snake rivers. Farming interests in eastern Washington, Oregon, and Idaho wanted access to more river water for crop irrigation. Shipping and business interests wanted the river to be tamed and navigable for commercial traffic right up to Lewiston, Idaho. The taming the river argument received a boost when in 1948, a flooding Columbia River destroyed the city of Vanport, Oregon, making homeless 20,000 people. This human calamity claimed the sympathy of the nation and the attention of its leaders, including President Harry Truman. Truman came to Portland to inspect the disaster and encourage people with whistle-stop speeches.
I want to see a regular flood control program in all these river valleys. And in addition to that flood control program, as I said yesterday in Seattle, I want to see the river develop for the benefit of the people.
Additional hydroelectricity was also needed, the BPA said, to power atomic energy facilities at Hanford, Washington.
The atomic energy plant calls for more electric power as science turns this discovery to mankind's betterment. Even the world's largest generators are insufficient to meet the mounting demands for power. New dams must be built, or America's vital electro industries will fail to develop or be forced to go abroad for their power.
energy for industry and atomic power, more farm products from irrigation, more trade from navigation, better flood control, and to the list add national security in the form of weapons manufacturing in response to the Korean War and the perceived threat of global communism. Those were the social benefits of hydropower as argued in the early 1950s. But there was also an allure to energy, almost a mystique. In mid-20th century, public relations and advertising were increasingly influential in framing public opinion and understanding. Northwesterners were told they could have it both ways. They could retain the region's wild heritage while enjoying the modern conveniences of technology. Being modern meant consuming more energy, and electricity was viewed as the genie escaped from, and now lighting, the magic lamp.
Portland, Seattle, Tacoma, Spokane, metropolitan centers all thrive under the new impetus, the reawakening of the Pacific Northwest.
Added up, the reasons for constructing more Columbia dams appeared too many. And while national politics had undergone a change with the election of the Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, the rhetoric about dams stayed fundamentally the same.
It is essential that every drop of water, from the moment that it falls upon our land, be turned to the service of our people. Thus we will save our soil and make it more productive. Thus we will develop power, prevent floods, improve navigation, and supply our tremendous and growing domestic and industrial needs for water.
A whole series of new Columbia and Snake River dams was scheduled. In 1952, construction began on the Dalles Dam. 8 miles upstream was Celilo Falls. So, the construction of the dam would cause the river to rise behind it into a reservoir and drown Celilo. About 5,000 Indian families were dependent on the Celilo fishery. Some Indian leaders protested the dam and the destruction of the fishery.
There's a good case to be made, and this is made sometimes by members of tribes and sometimes by non-Indians, that this was racially motivated to discriminate against the Indians.
They were going to build a dam whether we liked it or not. They were going to flood out Celilo, like it or not. You don't count. And that's the feeling that the tribes get. You do not count when it comes to fisheries.
Many Indians thought the Columbia River dams would harm salmon runs, despite what the government had been saying since the 1930s.
The Royal Chinook can leap at 20-foot falls, but it cannot hurdle the sheer ramparts at Bonneville, and it must get upstream to spawn. So a mile-long fishway was built around the dam, the strangest channel ever made by man. Instinctively, unerringly, salmon head upstream, and they find the new passage much easier than the boiling Cascade Rapids of yesterday. To thousands of families along the Columbia, the king salmon means their very existence. Chief Tommy can go on spearing the Royal Chinook in the tumultuous roar of Celilo Falls. The salmon are going through.
As salmon runs in fact declined, Indians got less and less of the harvest. Even while the modern world encroached, it was not as if Indians completely opposed modernization and non-Indian American culture. Nationally, more than 40,000 Indians served in the military during World War II, defending principles of democracy and equality. By the 1950s, many Indians lived in two worlds, wanting to hold to their traditional tribal identity and yet be included in the modern white culture.
We have very hard troubles of trying to be assimilated into the great American dream. There is good points on both sides. So nowadays, our traditional people have to live in two worlds, and we have to make them balance.
Some Indians wished to hold themselves apart from the agreement with the government and its agent, the Army Corps of Engineers. Different views were often held by the river Indians who lived at Celilo and those who lived on the reservations. In the face of apparently inevitable change, many tribal leaders decided to make the best of it. The government agreed to make a financial settlement with the tribes over loss of fishing sites and fishing in the vicinity of Celilo that had been guaranteed by treaty 100 years earlier. The tribal governments of Warm Springs, Yakima, Umatilla, and Nez Perce reservations received a total $27 million from the federal government, and the Dalles Dam was completed in 1957. Still, the river Indians knew that money could not replace the significance of Celilo Falls. For countless generations, Celilo had been a great gathering place for Indians from throughout the West, who in earlier days had come to trade their own goods, such as buffalo robes, for salmon. The possessions of wealthy Indians from the Dalles area reflected this trade. Not only trading happened at the villages at and near Celilo, there usually was time for social dancing. And gaming was popular.
You could go and fish, and it'd be nothing that night to go gamble somewhere and lose $1,000, and you could go make it up at the fisheries.
For all this, Celilo witnessed more than secular culture. Religious practices had a home here too. A glimpse of some of these practices was preserved at the historic last salmon feast inside the Celilo Longhouse before the inundation of the falls. The ceremonial distribution of 4 wild foods was in accord with Indian tradition and religion.
You know, there was the venison, which is the deer, the salmon, and the berries and the roots. And when meals are started, each is taken and given thanks for in turn. And you go from the river to the mountains in that sequence. And so it's really good to know and symbolically acknowledge the participants in your continued survival and your continued enrichment.
Like other Northwest tribes who have been sustained by salmon, the river Indians of the mid-Columbia saw the salmon as a sacred being who offered his life to the Indian and whose gift of life was deserving of respect.
We're not hierarchically above them, like with that kind of thinking, the man being the pinnacle and being, chosen by God to have dominion over all things. It's not that at all.
The special character of the relationship goes beyond respect to what Indians call natural law.
A lot of the knowledge and responsibility that indigenous or native people feel to place comes from their creation accounts. There was a time when animals could speak to people, and at that initial time there was this natural law, or this law of conduct, that was handed down from these spiritual, physical beings to the first people. And from that came about these natural laws. And out of those natural laws, as people went on down through the years, helped them establish their rules of conduct and their fishing regulations.
And I remember my grandfather or my mother would say, "You got to do this." And after a while I did not question, because this is handed down from generation to generation.
The Indians' intimacy with the natural world is ingrained by living in a certain way. It is very difficult to retain without the way of life, without partaking in the actions and in the community that grows around those actions. Columbia Indians still fish, and thanks to landmark legal decisions made in the late 1960s and 1970s, which upheld their treaty rights, they are entitled to half of the Columbia salmon destined for the Indians' usual and accustomed fishing places. However, as salmon became protected under the Endangered Species Act in the 1990s, the actual harvest shrank to very low numbers. To the extent that Columbia salmon populations recover, the harvest can grow. Tribal members have continued to celebrate an annual first salmon ceremony and feast, open to the public at Celilo Village, but it has not been quite the same with the falls gone and the fish trucked in from elsewhere. What seemed an unalloyed social good in 1930 or 1950 to industrialize the river seems perhaps not so obvious today, as hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent to try to restore endangered salmon and adjust the operations of the industrialized river to let this occur.
We have the kind of Columbia River that our public policymakers wanted. And I think, by and large, we live with those effects.
What is the fall of Celilo finally about? It is a turning point, a moment that highlighted clearly that the Columbia River had changed from being primarily a natural system to a human-controlled one. Is the remaking of the Columbia River mainly an economic story about progress and its inevitable costs? Is it a political tale in which the democratic principle of improving the lives of the majority triumphs, even if the minority loses something? Or is it a moral fable in which the newcomers first exploit the natives, but then reap the bitter fruit of a diminished world? Whatever perspective one brings to it, this seems a fundamental story of modern times, something finally not just about Celilo Indians or the Columbia River, or even just about America. Finally, it seems about an undercurrent that ebbs and flows against the power of the modern world. At Celilo, it was apparently drowned out, overwhelmed by the modern. That undercurrent is an old, traditional way of being in the world, another way of living, and ultimately of understanding and valuing life itself. While the specifics of the native experience at Celilo may be lost, this undercurrent of human life at one with nature is not. It has its own way and rises to the surface unpredictably, but with determination, like salmon at a waterfall.